Hello and welcome everyone to today's RettSyndrome.org RettEd webcast. This is Paige Nuez, Director of Family Empowerment at RettSyndrome.org, and mom to Katie, our beautiful 15-year-old high school freshman who also has Rett syndrome. On behalf of our board of directors and team, we're so pleased to bring you today's presentation. Your children are so important to us, and we believe in supporting you every day on our shared journey while we simultaneously and aggressively pursue research towards real treatments, interventions, and ultimately a cure for Rett syndrome. We invite you to please visit RettSyndrome.org for information regarding all of our research and family empowerment programs, and especially visit the RettEd page at RettSyndrome.org/RettEd, RettEd, to see our calendar of upcoming webinars. Registration is open for all of them, and you can also find links to prior RettEd webcasts and conference presentations. Before we begin today's topic, I'd like to share some brief tech points on how GoToWebinar operates if this is your first time joining us. The audio feed is open for our presenter only, so you don't have to worry about your background noise interfering with the presentation. If you look to the upper right corner of your screen, you will see a control panel window. We invite you to type your questions or comments in the question field throughout the presentation, and we will answer these at the end of the presentation, as well as any questions pre-submitted at the time that you registered. If we don't get to your question today, we will work with our presenter to get all writing questions answered and posted in a QA document to our RettEd webpage once completed. If the control panel is distracting you, you can minimize or move the window, and then you may expand it at any time if you wish to submit a question. The next point is the session is being recorded today, and we will post a link of the recording along with that QA document I mentioned to the RettEd webpage so you can listen again or share the session with others. If you're having trouble hearing, please check and turn up the volume on your phone or device. And we want to get started. I'd like to introduce Dr. Valerie Owen, PhD as Professor Emerita at National Louis University in Chicago. After over 20 years as faculty member in 2012, she retired from teaching full-time, but continues to supervise doctoral student research and teach part-time in the Graduate Special Education Certification Program. She began her career 40 years ago as a classroom teacher of children with autism, as well as those considered the most significantly disabled, including those with Rett syndrome. She serves on the professional and scientific advisory boards with us at RettSyndrome.org, is a moderator and administrator for the IEP Advocacy support Facebook group that we run, and Dr. Owen also co-authored the Education and Learning chapter in our Rett Syndrome Handbook, the second edition. Additionally, she serves on the Illinois Attorney General's Select Committee on Special Education and is the past president of Illinois TASH, the state chapter of TASH, a research and advocacy organization supporting individuals with the most severe disabilities. She's often sought after as a consultant and expert witness, advocating for disabled students' rights to access education in due process hearings and other litigation, and has participated in numerous individual education program IEP planning teams as an advocate for students. As a consultant with schools and school districts, she continues to work closely with teachers in reimagining teaching and providing access to curriculum for students who often have been denied access. In addition to being a founding member and former officer in the Disability Studies and Education Special Interest Group of the American Educational Research Association, she's a founder of the Second City Disability Studies and Education Conference. As such, she has actively worked to support a community of education scholars and practitioners who critically examine the interplay of disability and various aspects of society and culture through their research, practice, teacher education, and activism toward more inclusive schools and communities. So I can personally attest to the fact that Dr. Owen knows both sides of the aisle on this matter. She's worked with both academia and teachers in education, as well as advocating with parents for their students and children. And we are so happy to have you with us today. Val, are you ready for us to get started with your slides?
I am ready.
Great, thank you. I'll go ahead and send these over to you. Okay, I can see your slide.
Okay, and I know there's a way to make it only my slide. I didn't see that, so because I know they can see everything at this point, right? But I'll get started, and if there's a way to make it clean, then Paige, I guess you'll let me know.
Oh, it's fine. It's perfect. Go right ahead.
Okay. What I want to do today is just share some basics about the law, about what are good goals, not necessarily good Rett syndrome goals, because I don't think there are necessarily good Rett syndrome goals. I think they're good goals for your child. And so I want you to have some ways to evaluate whether or not it's a good goal or not necessarily give you a list of possible goals. And then talk about other things that are included in an IEP, and then what to do when things are going wrong a little bit, just some ideas. Some of you probably have more knowledge about that maybe than even I do because you're in the thick of things. But perhaps I have a few tips to share, and we can kind of answer some of those questions about what can I do. So to start out, just the basics of what are the rights and safeguards under IDEA. So what's part of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act? What's in the law, and what do you have a right to, and what does your child have a right to? The first is the free, appropriate public education. And I'm going to talk about what the court has ruled about that in just a couple of minutes, but everyone has a right to an education. Next is parental consent and participation. Actually, I knew some of the parents that were involved in developing the first law when it first came out in the 70s, and this was a really huge component of that. That parents had a right to participate in their child's education. Before this, children could just be placed in special ed or not receive any services at all without any parent even knowledge about what was going on. So this was a really huge part of the law. Non-discriminatory assessment, which we know is pretty challenging for girls with Rett syndrome because we don't really have many good measures of what our children know. Then what this presentation is mostly going to be on is the Individualized Education Program and what should be included in that. The next is the least restrictive environment. Some people think this means inclusion. It does not. In fact, the law, because of the way the law is stated, it really allows for segregation of children with disability. And so it's very challenging for those of us who believe in inclusion, but it also allows for, I know personally of some girls that didn't really appreciate being in an inclusion class all the time and needed those other types of classrooms to be in and actually function better there. So it does allow for that as well. And then due process. So what happens when you disagree? And there are some steps related to that. Then the steps to receiving special education services. For most of the children that we support and have in our lives, those referrals can be made from an early childhood program, or a family can make a referral if you're not in an early childhood program, although most people probably are. Then the next step is to determine eligibility. This again involves the assessment process. So when you have your child assessed, particularly the first time assessed for school, often you'll have what's called a domain meeting, or you'll look at the different domains. And what domains mean are things like speech and language and academic and physical and occupational therapy. So you'll have all these assessment areas, and you'll agree on what needs to be assessed or not assessed. Or you can use prior assessments, or you can just say, you know, we agree she has this issue, if you and the school agree, and we don't really need to do an assessment there. And that happens quite a lot with Rett syndrome, again, because it's very difficult to do assessments, particularly academic assessments or developmental assessments. Although a lot of times, you know, they'll still do the speech and language or physical occupational therapy, those kinds of assessments. And then the next step is an IEP meeting to determine the goals, related services, accommodations, and testing. At the end of that meeting is when you make a decision about placement. And so that's why it's really important to have everything that you want to have in terms of goals and related services, because that has an impact on the placement decision. So the placement decision is basically the classroom or program that your child goes into after you have the IEP meeting. So, and that's always made at the end of the meeting, not before. So you would go into the meeting, and even though you might be thinking this, you wouldn't say, okay, I want my daughter in full inclusion. That decision's made at the end of the meeting. So kind of have that in the back of your mind as you're thinking about the services you want to have provided, because that means that has serious implications for the kind of program your daughter might be placed in at the end of the meeting. Then the 3-year evaluation and eligibility determination. So every 3 years, you go through that process again. You'll have another evaluation with all the assessments, or you'll decide to use the prior assessments, and you'll determine if your child is eligible again for special education. Most likely, she's always going to be eligible for special education, but it's at that point that you make that decision. And again, you don't have to necessarily go through all that testing again, unless you choose to. You may choose to have some of those assessments done. In general, the term Individualized Education Program, or IEP, means a written statement for each child with a disability that is developed, reviewed, and revised in accordance with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So first, a little bit of history in terms of the Supreme Court. In June of 1982, the Supreme Court made its first ruling on free, appropriate education of IDEA. And it supported the lower court finding. Now, Amy Royally had a hearing impairment, and she could read lips, but she learned best and communicated best when she had a sign language interpreter. The district did not want to provide the sign language interpreter because of the expense, but also they said that she was making progress without it because she could read lips. And in fact, the court found that she was receiving an adequate education since she performed better than the average child in her class and was advancing easily from grade to grade. So even though she had the disability, she could read lips, she was still reading, she was doing the things she needed to do, and she was advancing easily from grade to grade. So siding with the school, the court ruled that the law requires schools to provide a basic floor of opportunity. It doesn't require them to maximize a child's potential. And I want to emphasize that word maximize because, and maybe when you say this, hear this, you'll know that I've had an issue with this myself. When I've been in hearings or written reports, I have had to be really careful to not use the word maximize, even though we want our education to maximize the child's potential. Schools particularly will really jump on this word of maximize, and if you use that word, they'll say, no, we don't have to maximize the child's potential. So And so it's important to think about your wording even in situations like that. That maximize is not a word that you necessarily want to use, even though we really do want to have that happen. You hope the school does that for every child. A later court, from the U.S. Court of Appeals, using that decision from the Supreme Court, said, use this analogy. It says, IDEA requires that schools provide the educational equivalent of a serviceable Chevrolet to every qualified student. Schools are not required to provide a Cadillac. And so this analogy has been used by a lot of schools in determining what children are entitled to. So they have a Chevy education, not a Cadillac education. And however, in this past year, the Supreme Court ruled 8-0. Now you have to realize this is our current Supreme Court, except at the time it was only eight members on the bench, but it was still 8-1, that an individualized education program must give kids with disabilities more than de minimis, or the minimal educational benefit. So Justice Roberts wrote that the de minimis makes no sense and is like receiving no education at all. For children with disabilities, receiving instruction that aims so low would be tantamount to sitting idly, awaiting the time when they were too old, when they were old enough to drop out. So what that means then is that even though they don't have to provide the Cadillac, they still have to have education that is rigorous and above the minimum. Judge Roberts wrote, even to kids like Drew, who aren't integrated into general classrooms, if that is not a reasonable prospect for a child, his IEP need not aim for grade level advancement, but his educational program must be appropriately ambitious in light of his circumstances. Just as advancement from grade to grade is appropriately ambitious for most children in the regular classroom, the goals may be different, but every child should have the chance to meet challenging objectives. So that means that it needs to be rigorous, it needs to be challenging, it can't just be the minimum. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Next, who's required to be at a meeting? First of all, you, the parent. Second, a special education teacher. Next, a general education teacher. And the reason a general education teacher is required to be there is that all the goals in the IEP need to be aligned with the general education curriculum. And so who better to know about the general education curriculum than a general education teacher? And some districts get around this by having the PE teacher or somebody that doesn't really know the general education curriculum very well. But it's important that you have at least somebody that can reflect on goals to make sure that the general education curriculum is at least being referenced in your goals. A district representative, and this person needs to be somebody who can make decisions about resources that can say, yes, we can do that. And that's really all that's legally required to be at the meeting. Then the student can attend, and then a representative from a transition agency when you're considering transitioning out of school, or sometimes transitioning within, like sometimes you'll have somebody from the middle school and the high school or something like that can be there. All others are optional and at the discretion of the parent and or the district. And so sometimes, and I know this has happened to me, you go into a room and there's like 30 people and you, the parent. And so what does that feel like? You're certainly outnumbered. But all those people don't necessarily need to be there. And so it can just be those 4 people. So what are the contents of an IEP? The first is the present level performance. I'm going to talk about that a bit more in a few minutes. Annual goals, measurable objectives, which are benchmarks or short-term objectives, are only for students who take alternative assessments. And that would be pretty much everyone who has Rett syndrome would take alternative assessments. You have to have the educational progress. You have to have special education and related services. On IEP, special education is in fact a service. And so sometimes when you see special education and related services, they're talking about all of those services, special ed and related, but they're all considered services on an IEP. The accommodations, alternative assessments, and a transition plan. If the transition plan is only if you're 14 or older. While the goals are an important aspect of your child's education IEP, they should not be the only things he or she should be learning. I say this because a lot of times, particularly for children who have more significant disabilities, the IEP becomes the curriculum. It is not the curriculum. It is not the only thing your child should be learning. A good curriculum has more depth and breadth, and often IEP goals can be incorporated into other classroom activities. So whatever the unit the other children are on, your child could be learning something related to that, or building upon their goals, communication goals or something in the context of the other things that are going on in the classroom. There should be opportunities to engage in a variety of subject areas built into the school day, so that you shouldn't just have a day that has your morning group and then your goal time and then lunch and then a break and some therapies and then you go home. There really should be a building around some curriculum during that day and goals incorporated into that. The other thing that I think is hard, particularly when you first start out and learning about these, is that individualized program doesn't necessarily mean individualized instruction. So an IEP mandates an individualized program for your child, but that does not mean it will always be individualized instruction. In fact, and I know this is true, sometimes more learning takes place in groups as children can model behaviors and learn from each other. It has to be built around that group, but certainly group learning is an important aspect of learning. Okay, present level performance. The 2004 reauthorization of the law clarified what is meant by educational performance. Before this, I would say that before 2004, the law was really silent on what children should be learning. And it wasn't until the 2004 reauthorization that the law really said that they needed to be learning academic and functional skills. Before that, it was whatever the school decided. So that was a really big change in the 2004 reauthorization of IDEA, that they clarified that it meant academic and functional skills. So the present level of performance is a narrative description of baseline data for multiple assessments. And it must include the student's progress in the general curriculum, how the student's progress in the general curriculum is affected by the disability, and should include areas of relative strengths as well as challenge. And you need the strengths because you need to be able to build on those. I think one of the hardest parts of an IEP, and it's for me, and I can imagine for families even more so, is that it's really built around deficits and what's wrong. And you go into a meeting and all you hear is all the things your child cannot do. And that's really hard. It's hard to hear that. It's hard to then feel encouraged about what you can do. And so it's very important that the strengths be be identified as well, because those strengths are the things you can build on. The deficits you may never be able to overcome, such as functional hand use. You may not ever be able to use your hands, but you can do other things that ameliorate some of that, or enable you to get tasks done in different kinds of ways. And so it's very important to build on those strengths. And I can't emphasize this enough. You cannot develop good goals without an accurate present level of performance, present level of educational performance. Do not leave this section blank. I see this blank on a lot of IEPs, and I wonder where in the world they got those goals, because you can't just pull a goal out of air. It's got to be built on something that the child can already do. So the present level of performance is really crucial, and it's important that you get accurate information and that is written very well for your child. So here's an example of a present level of performance. Mary enjoys listening to age-appropriate stories. When pictures are associated with main characters, she can identify up to 4 main characters by picture and printed names 8 out of 10 times for each. Using a choice of 3 pictures, she answers 4 of 10 factual comprehension questions. That's 40% accuracy. And Mary cannot sequence 3 major events in a story. So that tells you what she can do, what she's able to do, how she's able to do it, and from that you can build some goals. So an IEP goals. An IEP must include measurable annual academic and functional goals to enable the student to make progress in the general curriculum. And then benchmarks. Benchmarks are short-term objectives must be included for students who take the alternative assessment. Hopefully your district is doing that, including those benchmarks and short-term objectives. They don't have to do it for all students. Illinois is a little unusual in this situation because our state law requires all children with IEPs to have short-term objectives or benchmarks, but not all states do that. And part of the reauthorization in 2004 said that basically if students take the state test, then they didn't need those short-term objectives or benchmarks, because the state tests were the measures of their achievement. But for students with that take the alternative assessments, then they needed to have the short-term objectives or benchmarks. And then other goals to meet educational needs resulting from the disability, which could include things like OT, PT, or other kinds of things like that. I notice my voice is getting a little hoarse, and let me just say that I have kind of a cold today, and so hopefully I won't start coughing or something, but if you hear that, I apologize, but I'm pretty sure I can make it through this. Annual goals, they should be rigorous. So this is related to the Andrew F. case, the Supreme Court hearing. It says they have to have rigor. Have achievable but high expectations, assume confidence. And I've listed these 3 studies here, which have been recent studies. The Rett Syndrome Foundation has provided some funding for some of these, but it's still very important to know that our girls do have some competence, and a lot of it actually. And so now we have some tests, some research that actually supports that, primarily using eye gaze and using pictures, but they've certainly been able to show that they have competence. And so that's why I, even more so than before, believe that we can have goals that are high academically, that they're able to achieve them if they have the right kind of augmentative and communicative supports. If a goal is repeated year after year, question it. And I see this a lot. The same goal will be, I know some girls that I supported a number of years ago, they would have the same 20 words on their IEP year after year. And finally, I sat in the classroom once and watched that they were able to do that. But they kept having the same ones on there because they said they never met their standard. And what was happening was the girls got really bored with it. And so they stopped responding because how many times do I have to tell you that I know this? So once I made it clear that they did understand it, they did move on. But if you don't have someone like me that goes and sits and does that, then you need to start questioning why something's on there year after year. You need to be showing progress. Goals should have the following components. And so I'm going to have some examples of some goals here, but I don't want you to think these are good Rett syndrome goals. They're not. But they're examples of goals that you can create for your own child. And goals have certain components that the way that you know they're a good goal. One is that you have a condition, and the condition is what says something like, after listening to a short 2 or 3 paragraph passage. So what's the situation? So think about the situation that you're in. Then a behavior. Mary will answer 2 factual questions and 1 sequential comprehension question using eye gaze to select the correct paired word picture. So that's the behavior. So she's looking at the correct answer. The criterion, 100% accuracy for 5 passages. I think she should be able to do that every time, get it always right. A lot of times you'll have other ones that would say, like, you know, less accuracy, like 50% or something. I'll talk about that in a bit, but make sure that it's something that's a mastery, that you achieve something. And then the time frame, how long will it take for her to achieve that? So here's another example of a goal. So here's the present level of educational performance. When provided with opportunities to interact with peers and facilitated by an adult, Mary is able to provide 1 relevant comment or piece of information. And here's the annual goal. Mary will spontaneously engage in social interaction with a peer or adult using her speech generation device, such as a Toby, during unstructured time, lunch, recess, and transition, when in her standard or alternative position with her device accessible 3 or 4 times weekly. So you can see their present level performance is that she can do it when facilitated by an adult, and here the goal is that she'll do it spontaneously. So that's the growth that you'd see. So you're building on what she can do, and then you're going to have a goal based on that. And here's another example. Mary has an expressive vocabulary of 93 words with a mean length of utterance of 1.9 words. And so the goal is Mary will be able to use eye gaze as an input method of her portable SGD to access vocabulary of 150 core and fringe words, and generate 3 to 5 multi-word utterances to convey meaning to her partner on 4 out of 5 opportunities. So here we're increasing the number of words in her vocabulary as well as the length of the utterance of the words that she's able to say. So we're building on what she can do already. So what's a short-term objective or a benchmark? So short-term objectives are the intermediate steps to a goal. So first she can do this and this and this, and then benchmarks are the major milestones. So you can recall 1 fact, 2 facts, sequence. So what are the big learning chunks that you would learn along the way of reaching your goal? So these are required for any student who's exempt from the statewide achievement assessment. So here, based on the goal that we just had, so Mary will be able to use eye gaze as input method of a portable SGD to access a vocabulary of 150 core and fringe words and generate 3 to 5 multi-word utterances to convey meaning to her partner on 4 out of 5 opportunities. So our benchmarks are this. So the first quarter, Mary will access a vocabulary of 100 words. So she's first at 150, now she's at and generate. So the annual goal is 150. So our first quarter is 100 goals. Our second quarter is 120 goals. Our third quarter is 140 words. And then we're also increasing the multi-word utterances. So first we're going 2 to 3 word utterances, and then we have 3 word utterances, and then 3 to 4 word utterances, and then by the end of the year we have the 3 to 5 multi-word utterances. So you can see that those benchmarks are building each quarter. They're building on the quarter before and increasing the complexity of what she's the goal for that quarter. Measurable. What's measurable? Measurable means that the goals and short-term objectives and benchmarks must be written in a way that can be observed and that progress as indicated. Critical is the selection of the action verb of the behavior being measured. And if you notice in the previous goals, we had words like select, answer, choose, things that were action words, things that you could see, you could observe that happening. Words that you don't want to have in a goal would be Mary will know, Mary will develop an understanding, Mary will improve, Mary will feel. Those are things that you can't really see, and so you don't know that they happen. So some of the things, you know a student knows that because they selected the correct answer. So you want to think about, you know that they understand it because they answered the question. So you want to pick words that have an action to them that you can observe, because that's how you can measure that they happened. So always you want to have those kinds of good action verbs in your goal to make sure that you can measure it. Educational progress must include both a description of how the progress will be measured and how it will be reported. So how it will be measured will be, might be things like on a checklist, or will be every Friday on the test, or on the opportunities that you have. And then how it will be reported will be on the grading report. Sometimes reports are periodic to you, such as they get sent out with report cards. So you need to be able to see that quarterly progress on the goals, and those need to be communicated to you. The other thing about educational progress is make sure the criterion is meaningful learning and that it makes sense mathematically. So some good ways to think about it would be 9 out of 10 opportunities, and you saw that in the examples, or at least 80% accuracy. I don't necessarily like 80% accuracy or anytime you have that percent accuracy, because out of how many times? Is it 800 out of 1,000, or is it 8 out of 10? And what I find sometimes with some teachers in Illinois, and whether that happens other places, I don't know, is that they'll want it to be accuracy over the quarter, and you get diminished returns when you do that. As soon as the student reaches 80% accuracy, I say move on, and don't keep collecting the data and then average it over the whole term, because they may not know it at the beginning, but by the end they may already have showed you many times and are already bored and refuse to answer. So you need to have it at a certain level that you know that happens a certain number of days or whatever, and then you move on. Hopefully that makes sense, but but to think about how many times they have to tell you they know it. Then things that you don't really want to have, even in benchmarks, are things like 50% accuracy. Usually we think about accuracy being at least 80%, 85%. If you do something that high, then we think, okay, they've mastered it. 100% isn't always necessary, but at least something at 80 or 85%. 50% is not mastery of anything, and sometimes can just be chance. So if it seems like you're not going to get to be high enough accuracy, then you may need to just change the benchmark or change the goal so it's something that you can achieve mastery, and not have something that's 50% or 25% or some low amount there. It should be something that's mastery of something. And then if they have something like 90% accuracy and they have 3 questions at 90% accuracy, that doesn't make sense mathematically. You're going to have 33%, 66%, or 100%. 90% doesn't make any sense if you have 3 questions. So don't let them do that to you. Make sure that those mastery levels make sense mathematically. Now, related services and special education services. Remember earlier I said that special education is also considered a service. And so special education and related services should be scientifically based, meaning peer-reviewed gold standard research teaching strategies. Most of the strategies that we use in schools actually have some research behind them. If you think that the way your child's being taught doesn't have any research behind it, or you want to provide research to show that they need to be doing something differently, then recognize that teaching strategies do have peer reviews, they've been researched, they're scientifically based, and there are strategies like that. All services needed to advance progress toward meeting the goals and to participate in extracurricular and non-academic activities. So that's key, and extracurricular and non-academic activities. So related services and special ed also need to advance progress in those things as well. So it's not just what happens in the classroom, it's things outside of the classroom too. If you want your child to participate in, say, clubs or something outside of the classroom. If the student can benefit from the educational program without a related service, the school is not required to provide it. And this is really important. So even though your child might need a related service and might really need it, if they can benefit from the program without it, the school is not required to provide it. This goes back to the Chevy versus Cadillac program. And services, including how many minutes in classroom, are typically listed in minutes per week on your IEP. So you may see that on your IEP is how many minutes a student receives each of those. This I just took straight from the law, and I won't read it, you can read it, but it lists out the kinds of services that should be available in the school, such as speech and language and auditory and interpreting services and psychological services, physical and occupational therapy, therapeutic recreation. So a lot of things, including health services and nurse services, and social work and parent counseling and training. Actually, the law, I think, lists 13 different related services that should be provided. Ones that are important for Rett syndrome, the first would be nursing and a nursing plan for medical needs at school. And school nurse services are services provided either by a qualified school nurse or other qualified persons. And next, of course, is speech and therapy speech and language therapy for augmentative and alternative communication sessions and instruction, physical and or occupational therapy for apraxia and ataxia, positioning for breathing and avoiding constipation. Some of these can be direct services provided by these professionals. Sometimes they can be consultation. Also, perhaps you just have a physical therapist who comes in and makes sure that that the student is positioned correctly, that the teachers know how to make sure she's in her standard correctly, those kinds of things, but direct service may not be provided. Transportation is to and from school, but also in and around the school buildings. And if there's any kind of special transportation that's required. Adaptive PE and recreation is another one that's also important for Rett syndrome sometimes. And then the third one is assistive technology. Now, this isn't listed in the list of ones that the school should provide. However, the law also says that anything can be considered a related service if it's necessary for the child to be able to benefit from the educational program. So I put assistive technology here because a lot of things that that we need with girls with Rett syndrome can be included in this idea of assistive technology. So, and hopefully you're familiar with that term, but it's things like eye gaze technology, switches, pictures, ergonomic pencils or spoons, or any kinds of things that you need technology-wise in order to benefit from the program. Accommodations. There were also, as you finish the goals, there will be a section on accommodations, and those are the supports put in place that enable your child to access the curriculum and show what she knows. And it could be things such as sensory or meal breaks, which are often important in Rett syndrome. And also, probably something important to put would be instruction and goal measurement occur when she's in a regulated state. And those are two things that should come to mind often with girls with Rett syndrome and would be listed in accommodations. Alternative assessments are for students who do not take the federally mandated test. Most states have some kind of alternative assessment for students who have more significant disabilities. Your child may or may not take that as well. Transition planning. I know the last time I presented when you had a state conference, I did a session on transition planning. It's really important. I think when you're young, when your child is younger and you're constantly talking with the school trying to get a good educational program, you might forget that that's really a very short period of time in her life. And beginning at age 14, you really need to start considering what happens when the bus stops coming. There should be a form within the IEP that starts talking about transition planning. There should be some assessments around transition, both for you and your child, where you start to think about, okay, what kind of things might she be doing? What are our goals for her in the future? Housing goals, what's she going to do with her day? How is she going to take care of herself? Those kinds of things are an important aspect of transition. At a minimum, the school should be working with you on setting some of those goals and providing you some contacts for resources in your area that you can start early on thinking about what happens. Most of the time, your daughter can stay in school to the day before her 22nd birthday. When she's 22, she would have to be exited from the school program. Many districts have a 18 through 21 program, which is very different than the high school program, often, sometimes even in a different location than the high school program. And that program also should help with transition. And so it's very important to be thinking about this early on, because it comes very quickly, surprisingly quickly. And so transition planning is a very important aspect of your IEP planning, particularly as your daughter gets older. What can you do to prepare for your IEP? First off, hopefully your district provides copies of the reports if you did any assessments, annual assessments, say from speech and language or physical therapists, your report cards that you had that showed progress on the goals. Review the IEP from last year. What has your child received? What still needs to be achieved? Did the district send you some proposed goals? A lot of times they will send you the goals ahead of time. These are the things we're thinking about. And so that, particularly from the teacher. If your teacher doesn't send those to you, I would ask for them. What kind of goals are you thinking for next year, so that you come prepared. The next kind of things you could do would be consider observing your child in the classroom and pay attention to interactions with others and what's actually being taught. The next thing is, do you know the rules? What does the law say? So rightslaw.com is a really wonderful resource that can give you a lot of information about the law. Your state probably has a website. I know Illinois has a website that has good information. And then your district is also required to give you printed materials. Often that happens right at the meeting, however, and so then there's really not time to review that. So if you still have yours from last year, or you're interested, you can probably ask for that and they can send it to you. Then you can also write a present level of educational performance. What is your child doing academically? Based on the examples that I gave you. Social and behavior. What kind of things are happening there? Sometimes I found that the girl with Rett syndrome in the school is one of the most popular children in the school. But going down the hallway, everybody's saying hello and waving and saying things to her. And sometimes that doesn't happen because, for whatever reason, that causes a lot of anxiety to be around a lot of people like that. So think about those kinds of behaviors and what you think she needs and the kind of support she needs socially and behaviorally. Functional skills. What can she do? What can she not do? How is toileting, for example? Does she have any functional hand use? Can she touch a switch with her hand? Communication. What's the device she's using? She should have multiple devices that she can use, so that if her electronic device's battery's dead or it's not available, does she have other ways to communicate her needs to you? And what skills do you want your child to focus on this year? So bring all that to the meeting. And then what related services and therapies do you believe your child will need? Remember, therapies only need to be provided if they're necessary for the child to benefit from the program. And so if she's receiving some, do you think it's not enough, for example? Maybe she's been receiving something all year, but you think she needs more. Or maybe she needs less of one and more of another. Bring those ideas to the meeting with you. And then write down all your questions and bring them to the meeting. Also consider bringing someone with you. And I mentioned earlier that sometimes you can go to a meeting and there's 30 people there and you. So it's okay to bring someone with you. You can actually bring as many people as you want, but it should be somebody who knows your child or Rett syndrome and can help ask good questions. And then the decisions. So the placement decisions are made at the end of the IEP meeting. You don't have to decide at the meeting, however. You can visit classrooms and other programs, particularly if your district gives you some options and you have time, go visit those classrooms and see what you like about the different ones before making the decision about the placement you believe is best. So what happens if you disagree? What safeguards are in place for you? The first thing to do is if you don't agree with what the IEP team member said from the school, first try to work it out and reach compromise. For example, you could test the plan and agree to meet in a few weeks or a couple months and see how things are going. You can revise the IEP at that point if you and the school both agree. In some of those cases, you don't even need to have another meeting. If everybody agrees, you can just change the IEP. If you're still in disagreement, you should not consent to the IEP. Signing in at the meeting, at the beginning of the meeting, is not the same thing as consenting, however. And a lot of times they'll pass around a sheet of paper and make everybody sign in. That's not consenting because that happens before the meeting even happens. Put in writing your objections or concerns and send that to the school, and continue to resolve the disputes informally at first. So when that doesn't work, the next step can be mediation. And this is where school team members and the parents can talk with an impartial mediator and try to reach an agreement. Sometimes attorneys are involved at this point, but they don't need to be, and they aren't always. So it's not necessary that you have an attorney to go to mediation. The discussions are confidential, and if you reach an agreement, both parties will sign the agreement and it becomes legally binding. There's no cost to you or the school. Mediation is paid for by the state. So if you want to not file due process, the first step you can do is try mediation. And because when you go to due process, which is the next step, most of the time I would say you probably need an attorney for that, because the school district's going to have their attorney involved at that point. You can file a complaint. Occasionally, when you file a due process complaint, it gets resolved even just filing the complaint. There are some districts that don't like to go to due process and will just try to do things to satisfy the family. If you're in a district like that, that's really great. Sometimes it's not. When you file a due process complaint, however, you need to be very clear about the provisions of the law, such as LRE or related services or your IEP goals or whatever that you believe have been violated. So you have to be very specific about what the law says and how you think that's being violated in what's happening with your IEP. The resolution process will begin after the school receives your complaint and will include a meeting with the relevant parties. So before you go to hearing, you'll have a due process complaint, you'll have a meeting. Sometimes it gets resolved right there in the meeting and you don't have to go to a hearing. But the next step after that, if it doesn't get resolved there, is a due process hearing. And that's where you go. There's a trial. And both parties present evidence before a hearing officer. Hearing officers are often attorneys, but sometimes they're retired school district personnel or something like that. So some are good and sometimes not, but they all try to be impartial and hear the evidence and make a decision. the losing parties can then apply to state or federal court. And so sometimes it can go either way, but you do have, the only recourse after that is applying to the state or federal court for a hearing. Now, apart from that and separate from that, you can also file a complaint with your state board or Department of Education. This is something that you can do even before you file the due process complaint. If you believe that your school district is violating some component of the law, you can just file a complaint to the state board or Department of Education. Typically, they have 60 days to respond. This is separate from the due process, hearing, mediation. All of that is something totally separate. So you can file that with your state board, and they do have to respond within 60 days. So it would be similar to your due process complaint in that you have to be very specific about the provision of the law that you think is being violated, but it's separate from that due process hearing procedures. So that's what I have, and I'm wondering if Paige has questions at this point.
Great, thank you, Val. Dr. Owen, there was so much great information in your slides. Thank you so much. We have a couple of questions that have come in from our attendees, and if we can, let's go ahead and go through them. Give you a minute to take a drink of water there. Okay, so one question that was submitted is regarding a very specific augmentative communication device. It's eye gaze device called a Tobii. And a parent wanted to know is, can you request the school to have a Tobii or purchase a Tobii in order to obtain educational goals? How does that process work of obtaining the necessary devices?
My experience is yes and no. If a school district puts that in an IEP and the child doesn't already have it, it has often been the case that the school has been required to provide it. However, schools have gotten pretty smart about that, and they will often not include a specific device in the IEP, and they don't really have to, but they will say that they provide a different kind of device or any device, and it could simply be a board with the 4 pictures that the girl can use eye gaze to look at. So a much lower tech device. And so if it's in the IEP and she doesn't have it, then it may be the case that the district would need to provide it. But I will say that it's going to be an unusual situation where the district will say, yes, we'll pay for that and include it in the IEP. And we'll say that, it doesn't have to be the Cadillac. If she can benefit from it, then the Chevy is enough. So I know that's probably not the answer that you want, but that has been my experience. Now, I am also not an attorney. I am a teacher. So attorneys might have a different explanation than that, but that's what I see. They're very careful about that. Schools are typically very careful about that.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask a follow-on question to that? As relates to supporting some of these high-tech devices, I find that programming time is not a direct service, it's not a group activity, but there needs to be time minutes of service specified to support the programming needs of the device, changing the content and screens and whatnot. What would be your recommendation of where in the IEP that can be specified, and if it's a specialist versus the educator, in terms of providing related services that are not direct, individual, or group? Does that make sense?
Yes, I mean, to me that is could be fall under consultation minutes, which are often not direct service to the child. It could be some direct service to the child if they were provided, if the person came in and saw, okay, here are the things that need to be added to program the device to be able to do those things. I'm trying to remember like how it's ever been done before. And it seems like, my experience has been that it has been mostly in the consultation minutes. But I think even in your IEP, the consultation could be specified to say for programming the device, actually have that, specified in there so that it's clear that somebody is responsible for programming the device. That's really the main thing that you want to think about, is make sure that it's specified in there and that it's somebody's responsibility. You can build a lot of things around, build a lot of things within that consultation minutes to make sure that the responsible party is there doing those things.
Okay, and would that also apply to training the classroom staff? So as our kids are using more advanced technology for communication,
I don't think,
yeah,
I don't think that's consultation at all. I just think that's training. And that is something that you can just have in your IEP. It can just be a separate thing that staff need to be trained on how to use those. And you can certainly include that in any IEP. Sometimes I've seen it in the notes of the IEP. I can remember a number of years ago, I was working with this family, and they their child had Down syndrome, so it wasn't Rett syndrome, but the father called me frantic one night and was like, what do I do? It's like, where are the goals for the teacher? And I was like, nah, well, there aren't any goals for the teacher. They're all for the student in the IEP. So because he had the same question, it's like, what happens? The teacher doesn't know how to do these things, And so I think it's important then that you have in there that teachers will get training. And as I said, that could even be in the notes. But you want it in writing. It can be in notes that teachers will get training to use the devices or whatever other training needs that the teacher might need, that be included in the IEP. But it is appropriate to include that in an IEP, I would think.
Okay, so is that something that you would recommend that a parent write in the area of parental concerns?
I would think so.
That you're concerned?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
And it can be in the notes from the district. And I haven't been to too many IEPs that somebody's not taking notes. So beyond writing the goals and that sort of thing. So that somewhere written in the documentation in the IEP that there's something that staff would receive training.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let me move on to the next question. Parent writes in, my child starts kindergarten next year. She's nonverbal but ambulatory and constantly moving. It's hard for her to be still. She will be in a special education room, but also she'll spend time in a regular kindergarten classroom. Do you have some thoughts or recommendations for this family on how to manage in the general? I think maybe, I don't want to interpret, but perhaps she's asking how to manage some of these behaviors in the regular education classroom so they're not disruptive. and she can focus.
Well, hopefully she's in a good kindergarten classroom where a lot of the kids are active and moving around, which would be helpful. I think some of the things that would be helpful early on that she could even do at home would be reading stories with her, sitting and doing those kind of things. So think about the kinds of things that happen in a kindergarten classroom: reading stories, using materials, being around other children. There are ways that she can prepare, but then the goals would be written in such a way that, if she's unable to sit and listen to a story, for example, you're going to, over time, expand the number of minutes that she's able to sit and listen to a story, for example. So those would be the kinds of goals, but you wouldn't necessarily know that until you see how she responds in a classroom. And I can't, know, because I don't know this child, how much other time she's been around other children, or, what kind of communication skills she has, and that sort of thing. So part of it is going to be based on what her present level performance already is. And you won't necessarily know that if she hasn't been in a classroom situation yet until she's actually in the classroom and you can observe some of those kinds of things. The other thing is I wouldn't stress out too much about it at this time. It's a kindergarten class. And we first need to see how she's going to do in that classroom, and see, almost every time I have been utterly surprised by the competence that I observe when children are in classrooms like that. And so she may surprise you, and she's able to do a lot of things. She may be very observant as to what the other children are doing and try to do some of the same kinds of things. Once she learns the classroom, she may not be as active because now she knows where everything is and she's explored everything, and she's happy to just participate. So I think a lot of those, I understand the anxiety that a parent would feel about that. But the other thing is, as a teacher, I can say that, every new year started out with kids that, for whatever reason, were different or hadn't had those experiences before. And as a teacher, excuse me, I was able to, figure them out and help them be a part of that classroom. So, so relax a little bit. Try to get her engaged in kinds of things like books and listening kinds of skills and being around other children, and perhaps things will work out just fine. That's the best advice I can give.
Thank you. It's very reassuring. I hope that helps that parent. I think that going from preschool to kindergarten might mean a school change, and that can provoke a lot of anxiety, but you've had some experience with the IEP process. I'm thinking about our families who are going from early intervention into their first IEPs, where there's not a previous IEP to build from or build off of. So you're going into a new environment as well as having your very first IEP. Do you have some advice about how that new parent who's completely unfamiliar with present level of performance, how to quantify and write that for their child? Who might they partner with? Who might they ask to help, especially with that very first IEP?
Who might they partner with?
With the early interventionist team?
I would think so, because you're going to have some assessments. And so from the early intervention team should have assessments as well as some suggested goals. You might not have academic goals necessarily, but you could. Depending on your early intervention program. But you probably have speech and language goals already, and a present level performance, because most of the time The therapists are going to base the goals on the assessment results that they already have. Your physical therapy goals, your occupational therapy goals, those things are going to be right there, and that's your present level of performance. I think if you look at them and they're all deficit oriented, all the things she can't do, I would ask them, okay, you've done a really good job of telling me things she can't do. Would you please, outline some of the things that you think she can do? And then as you go into your kindergarten IEP meeting, then you'll have also some strengths that you can build on. So how can we increase the time she can do this, or add additional utterances, or have her be able to stand longer, or whatever it is that you want to say, okay, here's what she can do, and here are we going to increase those. And so, yes, those professionals that you've already been working with should be able to provide those for you. But also, I think you can ask the kindergarten teacher, who should be at the IEP meeting, what kinds of things that they work on in kindergarten. What are some of the goals? And depending on what you know of the competence of your child, you can also say, okay, well, I can see that you're working on identifying sight words. I would like for my daughter to be able to do that as well, if they don't have those kinds of goals on their IEP.
This all comes back to having meetings with people before you get to the IEP, right? Because it's very hard for a parent to project what the next school year's curriculum is going to be, and
Correct.
your current, yeah.
Correct. Yes. So, but hopefully, the early childhood program will help you transition to the kindergarten. I mean, that you already have a group of professionals that hopefully you trust and you have a good relationship with. I would talk to any of them. Any of them can probably help you with that transition.
Thank you. Okay, next question is around related services. And the parent asks, I've never heard of nursing as a related service. We happen to be fortunate enough to have a full-time nurse assigned to the school, but that could, of course, change at any time. Any thoughts on this?
Well, it's in the law that it's one of the related services. Medical services are as well, but not for diagnostic and purposes like that. I know that a lot of districts in Illinois, nursing has been one of the things that they started removing the nurses or sharing the nurses and that sort of things, and it's been a very big issue in Illinois, not for Rett syndrome necessarily, but there are lots of children that have diabetes, for example, or seizure disorders, or severe allergies, or a number of things that nurses are important for. And so there's been a big pushback against removing the nurses from the schools. I don't know what you mean by thoughts about that. Your particular daughter might not have necessarily any medical needs that would be that you would need nurses services at school. But if you had a seizure disorder, for example, or I don't know, Paige, you might help me with some other kinds of problems. That's been the main ones that I've been involved with, is they've had seizure disorders. What happens when your child has a seizure at school? Depending on your plan, what I saw happen often was that the seizure happened, the school would call an ambulance, the parent would be charged the payment for the ambulance and all that, when in fact all that really needed to happen was she just needed to lie down for a few minutes and then she was good to go. And so if you don't have that plan in place, you know, sometimes they overreact to a situation that really should have a simple solution. And so when you have a plan in place, then that sort of can resolve some of that early on. But I don't know, Paige, you might have more experience with that than I do.
Yeah, so I wonder if, and perhaps this parent could expand a little bit if I'm not getting this right, but I'm thinking that at this point in time, because they've had the benefit of a full-time nurse on campus at all times, they haven't written in specific related service related to their child. Maybe their child doesn't have seizures, but that doesn't mean that the classroom staff shouldn't be educated about some things about Rett syndrome. For example, a lot of the girls have episodes that look like seizures, and if the staff isn't adequately educated by the nursing staff, they'll overreact and call 911 thinking that she's having a seizure. Part of that is parent education and explaining their child, but also some things that are commonly at risk in Rett syndrome that the parent may not know about, how to adequately explain. Aspiration risk during feeding, low bone density. So very, big care, not keeping a child in a wheelchair who's ambulatory because of fear of that, but training staff. And that could be a combination of nursing and physical therapy on how to manage transitions, how to work with adapted equipment. I imagine maybe if there's not an overt medical diagnosis for something like epilepsy, there are things that are at risk in Rett syndrome that upfront nursing could be secured early in the school year. I don't know. I don't want to sit here and just go on and project, but I'm taking on questions that I've had from parents over the years.
Well, I think that my experience has been if there's not if you haven't identified that as a need and the child can't benefit from the educational program without that, they're not going to provide it. So, the degree to which you can make a case for that you need nursing services for aspiration, that was a good one, because that has happened, and the kinds of foods that you can eat, and what happens if that happens during mealtime, that somebody either needs to be trained by the nurse as to what to do, or the nurse should be available. And I think making a list of those things prior to the meeting and bring them to the meeting, and it might mean at that meeting then you create a nursing plan. These are the medical issues that my daughter has. Maybe you haven't seen them at school, but it could happen. And here's what we want to have happen during those times. And it might not happen. I remember with some twins that I worked with a number of years ago, the nursing plan was kind of ever evolving for them, and so it didn't necessarily always happen at the IEP meeting. They would come back and revise that a little bit later, which you can do if the school and the parents agree. You don't need to call another meeting, but it would evolve a little bit during the school year as things emerged and weren't as important. So and particularly when there were growth spurts and things like that, some things changed a little bit, and some things became more important than others. And so I think that that's also something that you can work on. But I would say that, if you have any concerns about that, then put it in writing and put it in the plan, even if you've had access, even if it's something like dispensing medication. Maybe there's a medication that your daughter gets during the school day. Who can do that, and how do you do that? And so, and it's probably not as important with Rett syndrome, but I know that at a school where I was, that we had a student that had a feeding tube, and the nurse was the person who came and did the feeding. So, have those things in place so that that if it so happens that they decide that they can cut the nurse, that you have a plan there that's they're legally required to provide those services to you in some way.
Okay, that's good advice. Thank you. So just make sure it's documented and in the IEP. So
Right.
in the event, that the school is no longer able to keep a dedicated nurse on campus, they're thinking of ways to keep your child safe.
Right, and and it could be that the nurse is out a day or something. I mean, whatever you need to have, the plan so that the nurse or designated person could do whatever needed to be done.
Okay. Thank you. I've got about 5 more minutes, and I've got quite a few questions in the queue. So let's plan to maybe speed through the questions so we can hear what's out there, and then in the follow-up QA document, if we want to expand, we can do that to make sure that we get to everyone's questions today.
Okay.
Let me ask this next one. I think it's a good one. Question is, how do parents find what testing and evaluations are out there that might work for their child with Rett syndrome? Or are there resources out there that would work for evaluating for IEPs? All right, so you referenced the recent research on the modified Mullins. How would a parent even know that those things are out there?
I would say most of the time you have psychologists or even the early intervention people that do those assessments that are aware of them. I mean, one of those studies used the Peabody picture test. For a lot of years, that has been, they didn't use the book that's provided, but they would take pictures of the book and cut the pictures and spread them out, because you could do the whole test by choosing from 4 pictures. And so they could modify that test in a lot of ways and maybe just cut it down to 2 pictures that you could choose from. Most people that do assessments and do assessments for students who have significant disabilities know of those. And if you aren't satisfied with that, and you can say, well, have you given the Peabody? Have you given the Mullen? You can ask those 2 questions, because really those are the only 2 standardized tests that I personally know of that do that. You can ask them, do you know of any others that can be modified in a way that my child can be more or less assessed using that. But I would also say that really there aren't any good tests. We do not have yet, although we're getting closer in the 3 studies from the last year. We're getting closer, but we really don't have the technology to be able to adequately assess children that have more significant disabilities. If you can't talk and you can't use your hands, there really aren't a lot of good assessments for that. There just aren't. And in those cases, hopefully you would have people that do those assessments that don't rely so much on those test scores, that use more informal measures. And you can ask, well, what kind of informal measures have you used to assess her reading comprehension, for example, or other kinds of academic skills? What other kinds of tests have you used informally to do that? Hopefully most people would be able to do that. A lot don't, and I will say that that's true. They'll really base everything on the test scores and say, see, she's severely disabled, intellectually disabled. But a lot don't, and I think more and more we're getting people in the field that don't just rely on the test scores and use a lot of informal measures. But right now, in terms of standardized tasks that you can modify a bit, to be able to get those kinds of measures. The Mullins and the Peabody are just about the only two we have, and you know about those two. So ask if they've used those two, and can they modify them to be able to assess your child. I think if there were more, you'd see more in the studies, and there aren't more. So how do you find out about them? Now you know. That's it. Did that help? Just mess it up more.
I think it's probably not the answer we're looking for, but it is the reality of
reality. We just don't have the
right
technology yet. We don't have the technology yet.
And we're getting there.
I'm really grateful that we have some real good research right now showing that there is competence, because it's stuff we always knew. We always knew that the competence was there, and so and now we actually have some research to show it. So to me, these are just huge studies.
Thank you. It was very intentional to go out and secure this information, both for research and clinical trial outcomes, but also to help families who for years have been, saying presume competence, and school districts and educators saying, give me evidence. So it's coming. And it truly is, right? We referenced a couple of papers.
And I think more and more we're getting evidence that schools are hearing that presumed competence part. There are a lot of people out there now talking, saying it, in teacher education programs and whatever. You hear it more, and I think when we do that, when we do presume the competence, we see the competence. And it really makes a big difference in the lives of the students when we presume competence.
We're coming up at the conclusion of our webcast, but we've got a couple of questions that are thematic, so I want to collapse them into two themes and see if you could touch on those, and then we'll have to close out for today. But one of them is about personal assistance, one-on-one aids, and the other is about a couple questions surrounding transportation and bus times, both hot topics.
Okay.
So to put you on the spot here, Dr. Owen, let me collapse. So the question on supports, personal care, how do you recommend a family go about securing that language, and what if a school district says no to the request for personal care? And specifically about language, there's another family who's had the benefit of a one-on-one for their child. So we have a couple families who have not been able to secure personal care, and then we have families who have secured a one-on-one, but they're recently changed the language in the IEP to wording of the child needing intensive supports. And should they be comfortable with accepting that alternative language, or should they be insisting on it being specified as one-on-one time? So what's the process for securing one-on-one supports and keeping one-on-one supports, and how important is the language?
Well, let me just say at the outset here that I have really mixed feelings about one-on-one supports. On the one hand, I think, for things like daily living, toileting, eating, somewhat communication, it's really important to have a designated person, both for the girl to feel comfortable and safe, but also just because you just need somebody to be able to help in doing those things. The other thing about that is, though, that it's very isolating for the girl to be around, have somebody always in between them and the environment. It's not very inclusive. And so the more people that can interact using her device, for example, the better. You want other children to be able to know what she's saying and be able to communicate with her. You want other teachers to be able to do that. So I have mixed feelings about having a one-on-one assistant all the time. it could be possible that in a classroom you could have 2 students that had significant needs, and you might share a person. That might be enough time if the other things are in place and other people know how to use devices and all that kind of thing. So I have mixed feelings about that. Then the other thing is, how do you get it on your IEP? If you really believe that it's essential and you want to have that, then first of all, make sure that the goals that you have, including communication goals, are very specific, that say, that has to be facilitated. That it has to be facilitated by an adult for that to happen. So the goals will lend themselves to that one-to-one support. That if you have skills, functional skills, daily living skills, that if you're working on toileting, for example, or something like that, that also make it very clear that you need to have a person that can provide that support for the student. So it's the goals that are always going to direct that level of support that you need, those assistants. It can be listed under accommodations or other related services. So I think that's how you make sure that it's there. And that the questioner wrote that they changed the wording. Why did they change the wording? They changed the wording so that it didn't have to be one person. So just as much as the district knows that you changed the wording, then you have to go back and say, no, I need this wording changed back, or we need to make sure that that it's changed in such a way that we know that there's one, maybe 2 people that are able to provide this service for my child. But the wording is critical, and the questioner was very right to question the questioning, to question the way that was written, because that's what the district did, to change the wording to make sure that they could provide the service in a different way.
That's great advice. So turn the question back on them, ask them why they changed the language and what does that mean.
Correct.
Okay. So a closing question, and I know that you said you're not a lawyer, but I'm sure that this has come up in many IEPs that you've worked on, is the issue of transportation to and from school. So specifically, this parent is asking that currently their child is on the bus for an hour each way, and that's just too much for her to be sitting. Maybe she's ambulatory and gets real anxious and can't sit still that long, or maybe she just shuts down and falls asleep. I don't know what the situation is. Could be anywhere on that spectrum, but how could you address that, and should that be addressed in the IEP?
I would say so. It's a related service, and it would also be, I have seen, for example, the bus ride so long that the children arrive to school asleep, and then it takes a really long time to get them up and functioning again. If the school even woke them up, which sometimes they don't. And so I think a lot of things go into this. First, why is the bus ride so long? For example, is it the placement? Is it where she is on the route? Is it could there be an alternative way to get her to school? So I think there's questions to ask about that. If the school is so far away that the bus ride is that long, is there a closer school or classroom where she could attend, for example? Because it is a significant issue, I think, to have such a long bus ride. I do not think there's any legal basis for saying an hour is too long, especially some schools that are in very rural areas. A lot of bus rides are that long. So, and I don't know where that child is or what the situation is about the bus ride, whether she's the first one picked up and the last one dropped off, or something like that. It could just be a change in the route, if it's particularly problematic for her. But I think it's definitely something to be discussed with the school. I wouldn't even necessarily think that you need to wait until the next IEP. You could address it early on, first talk to the teacher, then maybe move up to your special ed director or whoever the person at the IEP meeting is that can make those decisions, and see if something can be changed. Bring your documentation as to why you think it's too long, what happens as a result of the length of that trip, and see if something can be worked out that way. Again, I don't know of a legal basis that would say an hour is too long, so it would really have to be around the kind of service that's provided and her response to it. Probably also not the answer that you want.
Okay, thank you. Well, no, I think that's really good advice, and to focus on her state of being when she arrives at school.
Right.
So if she's distressed, if she's anxious, if she's asleep, all of those things are not arriving at school ready. And
Right.
if that's coming from transportation, then it's a relevant conversation to have at the IEP. Thank you.
Yes.
Good advice. Okay, so we've agreed to keep our RettEd webcast to an hour and a half. I know that never feels like long enough, but this doesn't have to be a one-time event. There are so many issues around IEPs and school plans and programs that I hope that you'll join us again, Dr. Owen, for some future time with our families. And families have asked where are some other resources that they can turn to. And I'd like to remind everyone that Dr. Owen was a contributing author to the Rett Syndrome Handbook, second edition. If you're just starting your journey with school, starting to think about facing it if your child's newly diagnosed, or wherever you are on your journey through adolescence and transition to adulthood, refer back to the handbook. There's some really good information there, as well as on our website at rettsyndrome.org. If you go to About Rett Syndrome and Resources, there's a nice small manual that was produced by one of our Rett clinics out of UCSF, which is a very nice, condensed, short summary of a lot of things that are globally important to all girls and boys with Rett syndrome around just socialization, mobility, communication, and involving a medical team to make sure that your child is safe at school, because they can have a wonderful experience at school, they can grow, they can thrive, and you shouldn't be afraid to send them off. It should be a wonderful experience. And I think with a lot of the nuggets of wisdom that you shared today with us, Dr. Owen, hopefully parents feel a better sense of optimism about what can be procured, and they also know some channels to pursue if those things aren't being made readily available and offered. So would you, at this time, is there any closing thoughts you'd like to share with our families before I give some follow-up information about next month's webcast?
No, I don't really have too much else other than, if anybody, if you have a question or something, one way that you can reach me is through the Facebook, closed area. I can't remember the name of it now. But you can reach me through there. Paige can give you the information and get you connected. And we can actually have even a private conversation if you don't want it posted. I know most people that are on that group are actually other parents. There are a couple of us that are professionals that are on there, but mostly it's parents. But if you have a question, you can also contact me through Facebook and be able to, maybe we can have a private conversation. So.
Great, thank you. Thank you for offering that. So that Facebook forum is called Rett Syndrome IEP Education and Support. And it's a private forum, and Dr. Owen is one of our fantastic volunteer moderators. We also have some very experienced parents who have gone through partners in training programs and have also made themselves available. So that is a great place to have conversation, asking our moderators questions, but also asking others in the community who've gone before you what they've done. So that's a great alternative live environment to conduct things. And we know the timing of this webinar might be catching you, some of you, as you're going in to your IEP planning for next year, or this may have come right after you just did your IEP. But again, never be afraid to ask for an amendment or reconvene an IEP meeting at any time. It's not set in stone.
That's correct. You can change it at any time.
And our children change. So what seemed a good idea this spring for next year may not be who she is and what she needs when the fall rolls around. So always think of it as a dynamic process.
That is correct.
Okay. Well, again, thank you so much for your presentation. We have recorded it. Everyone who attended today will receive an email probably later this afternoon or tomorrow with a link to the recording. Dr. Owen will also send me her slides, which I think for this particular session would be really good for me to upload to the website, or just reach out to me and I'll send them to you directly. Take advantage of that Facebook forum. Just do it on the search function in Facebook and you'll be accepted. We do try to keep that forum reserved for parents and caregivers only, so that the conversations can be unencumbered by fears of educators or district employees. You know, we can't guarantee it, but I know our moderators do a good job at trying to make sure that it's a protected place for parents to have open discourse. So we just really appreciate you, Dr. Owen, and your energy and enthusiasm over the years for our kids and advocating for our kids. We can't thank you enough. You give us all hope, and we wish you the best with your continued work, and we count ourselves lucky to have you as a partner.
Thank you,
at rettsyndrome.org and to our whole community. So thank you.
Thank you.
To everyone who's still here, I want to thank you, and we hope you found value in today's session, and that you take advantage of the million great nuggets of wisdom that were shared with us today by Dr. Owen. We believe that all the information about Rett syndrome should be free to everyone who avail themselves of it. So, of course, we have to thank all of our donors and supporters for that shared belief. And by hosting these webcasts, we can redirect more precious dollars into research that will help all of us globally. So we want to help you stay connected to best practices in the here and now while we're working on those research endeavors. Our children are so worth every effort to overcome their challenges, and they can't do that without us being educated ourselves about how to best help them. So thanks for being with us today. Take the information, apply it, share it with others. Look at our calendar of future RettEd webcasts. They are the second Tuesday of every month, same bat time, same bat channel. You can go ahead and register for all of them now. Next month, on June 12th, we'll reconvene to discuss movement disorders in Rett syndrome, hosted by a movement disorder specialist neurologist, Dr. Bernard Suter from Texas Children's Hospital. So I hope that you join us next month. And until then, we wish you the best of spring and the best of luck with all of your IEPs. Thanks for joining us today. Bye-bye.